Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are pulling back that big velvet curtain on history. We're going to look at how some of the most powerful people who ever lived met some of the most bizarre, undignified, and frankly, just plain embarrassing ends you can possibly imagine.
I mean, when you think about it, we kind of imagine it's all glory and honor, right? A monarch's final moments. They're supposed to be the stuff of legend, a grand finale to a life filled with power and prestige.
But, as we're about to see, the historical record often throws a massive wrench, or in one very specific case, a pig, into those grand expectations. For some rulers, the end was less of a noble exit and more of a historical punchline. So let's start with the hazards of the job. Okay, so this first category of graceless exits, you could probably file these under workplace accidents. These are the monarchs whose duties, their passions, or just the absolute chaos of their reigns led directly to their very untimely demise. So, our first case study is James II of Scotland. Now, his story starts with a literal bang, the assassination of his father, King James I, back in 1437. And just like that, little James was crowned king at only 6 years old. Now, obviously, a 6-year-old can't exactly run a country. So his childhood basically became this chaotic Game of Thrones, with all these different regions fighting for power. His English mother pushed out almost immediately for being, well, English. Then came cousins and lords, and every single one of them was trying to get more influence in what was a really hostile political environment. And that tension, it boiled over in a truly horrifying way at the infamous Black Dinner of 1440. Two young rivals from the powerful Douglas clan were invited to have dinner with the young king. But mid-meal, this symbol of impending doom, a black bull's head, was thrown right on the table. And despite the little king's pleas, the boys were dragged out and executed right there in front of him. Can you imagine? What a childhood memory.
After somehow surviving that traumatic youth, James II actually grew up to be a surprisingly successful king. He was really popular with the common folk, and he was a huge advocate for modern military tech. His absolute favorite things? Cannons. He just loved them.
And here is the brutal irony of his life. That passion would be his undoing. While he was trying to recapture one of the last Scottish castles from the English, he stood just a little too close to one of his beloved cannons. It malfunctioned, it exploded, and it killed him on the spot. The very thing that symbolized his modern power became the instrument of his death. Okay, next up we've got a royal who was, let's say, less interested in conquering and way more interested in chemistry. Archduke Alexander Leopold was a genuine science nerd, a guy who much preferred playing with his chemistry set to playing politics. So, in 1795, to impress his visiting cousin, Alex decided he was going to put on a spectacular fireworks show. And, because he was a man of science, he set the whole thing up inside a fortified armory, planning to shoot the rockets outside. But, well, Mother Nature has a wicked sense of humor. A gust of wind blew the very first rocket right back into the room, igniting the entire stockpile of gunpowder. The explosion that followed was fatal. It's a tragic lesson that being educated doesn't always mean you're smart. All right, now we move from deaths that were kind of caused by the job to those caused by sheer, unpredictable, and often comical bad luck. This is where history stops being a tragedy and starts feeling a whole lot like a cosmic prank. So meet Philip, co-king of France in the early 12th century. At just 15, he was the classic arrogant teenager. He wouldn't listen to his father, King Louis VI, and according to one writer from the time, his attitude made him a burden to all. Then, one day in 1131, Philip was doing what teenagers do, racing his horse recklessly through the streets of Paris with his buddies, and all of a sudden, a stray pig just darts out of an alley right into his horse's path. The horse trips, sending the young king flying. He landed with a sickening crunch, fractured all of his limbs, and died from his injuries the very next day. Our next monarch, Martin of Aragon, was actually known as Martin the Humane, mostly just for being a little less murderous than the guys around him. But by 1410, his life had taken a really sad turn. His wife and all 4 of his children had died, leaving him obese, depressed, and totally alone on the throne. To cope with it all, he turned to food. And on one fateful night, after he ate an entire roasted goose by himself, he was suffering from some pretty serious indigestion. He lumbers off to bed and, hoping for a little cheering up, he summons his court jester. So the king asks the jester, "Hey, where have you been?" And this This was the jester's reply. This joke right here, this seemingly harmless little observation, is the joke that supposedly brought down an entire dynasty. So the story goes, King Martin found this joke so hysterically funny that he just started laughing, and he couldn't stop. He laughed for 3 hours, fell right out of his bed, and died, apparently from a heart attack. And with no heir, his death was the end of the House of Barcelona, which had ruled for nearly 300 years. All because of a joke about a deer.
Which brings us to our next category. I mean, we've seen death by cannon and death by pig, but for some rulers, the biggest threat wasn't an invading army or some freak accident. Nope. It was their own appetite.
Our final category takes us into the royal dining hall and, well, the royal privy. This is where two kings' last moments were defined not by dignity, but by overconsumption and just the simple frailties of the human body.
First up, King George II of Great Britain. By 1760, he was 76 years old, partially blind, and pretty hard of hearing. But he was a man of very strict routine, which always began with a 6 a.m. cup of hot chocolate.
On the morning of his death, he followed that routine perfectly. He drank his hot chocolate and then excused himself to what the history books politely call his cushy secondary throne. A few moments later, his servant heard this tremendous crash. The king was found on the floor and died shortly after. The autopsy later revealed he'd suffered a thoracic aortic dissection. Basically, the main artery from his heart had just ruptured from the strain.
And finally, we arrive at the man, the myth, the legend, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. His reign was so peaceful and so uneventful that, unfortunately for him, the most memorable thing he ever did was die.
On February 12, 1771, the king sat down for a feast. And let me tell you, what a feast it was. He put away lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and washed all of that down with champagne. A truly royal meal. But he wasn't done yet, because after that massive meal, King Adolf Frederick then ate this many servings of semla, which is a really rich Swedish roll that's filled with almond paste and whipped cream. 14 of them. So, the story goes that this incredible act of gluttony gave him a fatal case of indigestion. Now, to be fair, modern historians are pretty sure this story was political propaganda. The official autopsy, which we still have, says he died of a stroke. But come on, that's not nearly as good a story, is it? The legend of the king who ate himself to death was just way too delicious to forget. So, after exploring death by cannon, by pig, by laughter, by toilet, and by dessert, what's the big takeaway from this little tour of undignified royal ends? What does it all mean?
Well, when you strip away all the crowns and the titles and the ceremony, these stories really reveal something deeply and universally human. They show us that behind the portraits and the propaganda, these were just fragile people, subject to the same random, absurd, and embarrassing fates as the rest of us.
Ultimately, I think they're a powerful reminder that history isn't just some grand narrative of big battles and important treaties. It's also a collection of small, strange human moments that prove no one, not even a king, is immune to a truly graceless exit. It really makes you wonder how many other grand legacies are walking that very, very thin line.